What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to dive into the masterclass on deep diving crankbaits. Summertime bass fishing. It can be wintertime. Deep diving crankbaits, catch them no matter what. So this is going to be really the masterclass on no matter what it is. But it is summer right now. You see how the Magellan gear tied up, put the buff up. We are in the shade, we're hiding from the sun. It's gonna get smoking hot today. Before we dive into all the intricate details of everything that we have here, I'm gonna give you guys all the goods, like everything that I know. I'm not gonna say it's all right, but I'm gonna tell you it's years of experimenting, and this is sort of what I've come up with and the reasons behind it. I'm gonna go from sort of the beginner to intermediate, and then we're gonna go advanced, sort of towards the end of like really diving into some of the stuff that makes me think why the bass will do what they do. So before we get into that though, one way to support the channel, if you guys enjoy this content, if you are a subscriber to the channel, if you aren't, just go ahead and click that subscriber button, subscribe to the channel, turn your notifications on, so whenever we have a video pop up, go ahead and it'll pop up in your feed, you'll know what's going on. And then last but not least, we do have merch. So we have Wheeler Fishing merch and we have Ding merch. I am going to drop a link in the description below if you guys want to support the channel in any way, shape, or form. This is a great way to do so. So we have hats, shirts, all that good stuff, and it's something that we've sort of come up with and have a lot of fun with it. So anyway, without further ado, let's jump into crankbaits.
Let's go.
We're here in Mexico. We are in the Dominican Republic. So I'm going to tell you a couple different tips that have helped me over the years.
Wow! Unbelievable! Jacob Wheeler makes history!
Okay, so I'm trying to figure out exactly how I want to start this because there's so many things to really dive into as far as the crankbait world. Okay, now the first thing I'm going to say is when I first started crankbait fishing and deep diving crankbait fishing, deep is a relative term. Deep is dependent on the area of the country you're in. Okay, in Indiana, for instance, where I grew up, a Rapala DT10 was a deep diving crankbait. A lot of the fish that got offshore, they were in that 8 to 10 foot zone, and this bait was the first bait that I actually learned how to deep dive and crank with. That and old school balsa plug. So now in some areas of the country, you go to spotted bass fisheries, 25 feet deep. And that's when you know a DT20 might be a deep diving crankbait that you're throwing, bigger, deeper diving plug. So it really just depends on the area of the country that you're in. Offshore can be anywhere from 4 feet to 30 feet of water. Now typically your main cranking zone, in my opinion, is that 8 to about 16 foot of water. It's hard to get a deep diving crankbait down deeper than 20 unless you're throwing a really big giant plug, and they will only bite that for a handful bit of time throughout the year, and there's only so many bass that are big enough to bite those crankbaits. Now I've caught some little ones on it, don't get me wrong, but you can get down to that 20 foot zone with that DT20, and that's about, I mean, you can get them down there 30 if you're going a long line and all that stuff, but that's neither here nor there. That's a lot of stuff. Really the zone that we're going to focus on is that 8 to probably 16 to 18 foot zone. That's where I feel like the key is in deep diving crankbait, no matter where you're at in the country. Now, as far as lure selection, there's a lot of different lures out there on the market. The key with lure selection is understanding what that lure does. And I have 2 different kinds of crankbaits that I have right here that I feel like do 2 things completely different. Now, we're going to dive into that just a little bit further into this video. The first thing we're going to talk about is color. Okay, how do you select the correct color? Color can be overrated at times, but then I've also seen it where it actually truly does matter. Typically matters more hues than anything. I don't think, you know, hey, this pattern of this bluegill necessarily, you know, when you're cranking that crankbait out of the face pretty fast, I don't think that matters as much as just the overall look. It's a muted down, you know, they can look at that and think it's a shad, it's just as well, but it looks like a bluegill. So it's a muted down sort of shad, bluegill, baitfish looking profile. And then there's also your brighter colors, like this one right here. Your blue chartreuses, which is this muted down blue chartreuse, or your you know, green chartreuse. Now your brighter colors, there's gonna be time and place for those. And typically how I select color is all dependent on the clarity of the water. The dirtier the water, there's a lot of times that I'll be throwing the brighter colors. So if I see the water's 1.5 feet, 2 foot of visibility, and I want those fish to see this crankbait really well, and they just got out there offshore, I'm going to select the brighter colors typically because I feel like they're going to be more aggressive. Now, as the year goes on and they get a little bit less aggressive, even in that same water clarity, I might go with more of a translucent color like this, almost clean, and just have the bait and those fish be able to feel that bait with a lateral line rather than being able to see it that well, and they're going to slap at it. So there's some little keys you can do depending on the color. But realistically, there's 3 different types. You have the bright colors, you have the shad colors, and then you have the more natural colors. So whether it's translucent or it's muted down really well like this big shad, the more natural colors. Again, I keep that very simple, all based on water clarity, and the clearer the water, the more natural I want it to be. But again, there's times that I'll throw the natural colors later in the summertime or later in the year if the fish are pressured, because they will react to a natural color in stained water, just because sometimes I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen. If I've even seen it, like if it's really sturdy water, dirty water, like 1 foot of visibility, I'll go from a chartreuse color to a white, like a straight white, almost like this guy right here. I'll go to more of that white opaque color, and that seems to do a pretty good, it seems to be pretty legit. So now, as far as crankbait goes, I'm going to dive into this real quick here and the reason behind it, because I wanted to go to the colors just to keep it on the simple side of it and start off with something that does truly matter. But this is really the key to this whole video, is understanding that all crankbaits aren't created equal. I have 2 different types of crankbaits here. I have a DT series line of crankbaits from the DT10 all the way to a DT20. And then I have the Cliffbanger by 13 Fishing, and it's a 12-foot diver all the way to a 15-foot diver. So there's one right, it's a 12, that's a 12. I have a 15-foot diver on. Okay, so a 15-foot diver to a 12-foot diver. Now, the difference of these crankbaits is one thing. The first glimpse you're going to see is, okay, this one is made out of balsa, this one's made out of plastic. Next thing you're going to notice, this one has a lot of sound, this one has a very subtle sound. But the key with these 2 crankbaits is when you put them in the water, okay? One does something the other doesn't, and one's unbelievable for one thing, and the other is really, really good for the other thing, that application that I look at. Now, they can both be used for those applications, but this is when you're really fine-tuning it. So, the DT14 or DT16, DT line of crankbaits, for me, is my go-to crankbait when I'm fishing offshore schools. It's subtle, I can change my color selection. When I'm fishing offshore schools or groups of fish on points in hard bottom areas, this crankbait gets bit. It's a little bit subtler than most crankbaits out there on the market. Again, it has just a real small little rattle in there, very subtle. But the key with this crankbait right here is it stays on the bottom. It's not very buoyant. The reason why this crankbait is so good at what it does is it gets down there and it stays at that desired depth, bouncing on the bottom. Now, if I'm fishing offshore schools of fish, or if I'm fishing hard bottom, the whole key with the crankbait is deflecting off of the bottom or off of cover. And this is why when I select this crankbait, this bait is kicking up, it's moving, it's literally just deflecting off that bottom, and that is when those fish go down there and pin it on the bottom. A lot of times it's why you see a fish come down and it's hitting the bottom, and you'll have a hook right here, because he goes down and he just tries to pin it on the bottom to grab it. That is why the DT line for me is one of the main reasons I use it for that application. Now, what I use for is completely different. What do I use this Cliffbanger for? Okay, the Cliffbanger, the reason why it is such a great crankbait is it's super buoyant. Okay, so buoyancy, what makes this crankbait so good for offshore schools was what makes this crankbait so good for cover. okay? When I'm talking about fishing stump rows or brush piles, this is my crankbait of choice. Not that you can't crank them with this one, but it makes it easier. You know, it's just like selecting a tool in your garage and having the correct tool for the applications the exact same way. You probably can get by with some needle nose pliers to get that bolt off your battery, but a socket set for the exact size that you have on the battery to take it off would be a heck of a lot easier. Now that's exactly the same way I look at both these lures. Having the correct crankbait for that application is very, very key. And then when I go to cranking the cliffhanger, same thing. I have a 12-foot diver and a 15-foot diver. Depending on what I'm fishing, so I say I'm fishing stumps, I crank it down through there and it hits that stump and I let it float back up. It floats very quickly. So what happens is this crankbait is not going to get hung up as easy, but it's also not going to stay on bottom. The key to this crankbait is it's actually coming down there and hitting and deflecting off of cover, trees and logs and all those things, which you all know if we can't get through the brush pile or get through the wood, you won't catch that fish. So that is really the key between what I sort of dropped right, you know, what I selected right here, and the key between those two different kinds of crankbaits. Now, so I have two different rods right here. I have a 7-11, this is actually a prototype rod that I'm working on right now, and this is a 7.6 cranking rod. Distance is everything when you're crankbait fishing, especially when you're trying to get depth out of your crankbait when you're fishing offshore schools. So I'm going to start with this guy. A 7-11 cranking rod is all about, it's not about being able to impart the action of the crankbait, it's about being able to have more leverage and more distance to be able to ultimately leverage that crankbait and get it out there 20 or 30 feet more, because ultimately that crankbait will be on the bottom longer and stay in the strike zone, again deflecting off of the cover, or deflecting off the bottom and the hard cover like rock and all those things. That is the key with having a longer rod. So if you're not fishing you know, schools of fish, and trying to get your crankbait, say if I'm throwing a DT20 and they're 18 feet, I have to make that cast, and I have to go around that world cast and let that whole rod load up and get it down there and just be able to get every bit of distance I can out of it. Because realistically, if I make a 120-foot long cast, this crankbait will be on the bottom in 18 foot of water, about 60, probably about 70 feet of that cast. So you have to make that long cast, and that's what allows that rod, that length of that rod allows you to do that. As far as reel selection, line selection, I like a 6/8 to 1 gear ratio reel. A paradigm casting reel is what I use. You can throw 6/3 to 1. I know guys throw 5/8 and 5/3 to 1. I've switched over to the 6/3s and they've worked really well for me. I feel like speed is a very important part of getting those fish to react offshore and just being able to crank that and speed cranking the crankbaits and casting that crankbait out there and really burning it. So I like a little bit more of a higher gear ratio, because at the end of the day, when I want to really make those fish react, I can burn this crankbait as fast as I possibly can and get those fish to commit to that crankbait. So that's the reason why I select that. Now as far as line size, I keep it very simple, because I am trying to get the most desired depth, the most depth out of each crankbait that I'm throwing in that DT lineup. I'm going to select a 12 or even a 10-pound fluorocarbon. My favorite line is 12 fluorocarbon, sub-advanced fluorocarbon, but if I'm trying to get this crankbait down there to even deeper depths, you're going to probably get about a foot to a foot and a half with every couple pound line. Basically, it's actually about diameter, but at least with what I've seen with the Suffix line, is about a foot and a half difference on a long cast of hitting that bottom. So that can make a big difference. The problem when you get down into that lower line size is it comes down to you don't have the durability of your line anymore. Okay, so now you nick your line. You have to be very patient and very cautious about what's happening when you get a little nick in your line. Then you can literally break off the next fish. And it's very easy also with 10-pound fluorocarbon on a casting rod. You get a backlash and you get a kink in that line. You go to reel that crankbait down there, one bites it, pow, breaks you off. So 7-11 cranking rod for fishing offshore schools of fish, or trying to get my crankbait, if I'm trying to get my crankbait down to the deeper depths. That's what I'm going to suggest there. For an all-around deep diving crankbait rod, I'm going to select the 7.6 crankbait rod, okay? Realistically, you can do whatever you know, there's a lot of different cranking rods out there on the market, but this rod right here is one I designed for specifically for cranking and having the all-around crankbait rod, okay? So I can fish this offshore if I want to have one rod, and you can't get super specific. This is the rod I'm going to have, and the reason behind that is, yes, I'm going to miss out on a couple inches of distance, maybe, or a couple inches of length on the rod where I can get that distance, but this is going to be a lot better all around when I'm fishing offshore. I can still get a very long cast with this rod. It has more of a medium heavy action. And then the big key with this rod over a 7-11 is more about imparting action to the bait and be able to have control. When you get to that 7-11, like the 7-11 length, it's almost a little bit clunky. It's a little bit large. It's big. It's just, it's a lot. It can wear you out throughout the day. A 7.6 is still fairly light, and for me, that's really important when I'm cranking around brush and I'm cranking around stumps. So I can ultimately stop this. I'll see here if I can. I'll crank that crankbait down there, and it's a lot easier to impart little snaps and little turns into my rod with that 7.6. And it also allows for me, when I'm casting out there on those places, I have a little bit better as far as precision casting goes. So say if I see the brush piles right here and I know that cast, I have a little bit better grasp of like making that cast, a little bit more accuracy with the 7.6. Now as far as line size goes, this is where I'll change it up. I'll throw a 15-foot diving crankbait in a brush pile with 14-pound subexpanded fluorocarbon. Now, that brush pile might top out in 8 foot of water. And a lot of times what's happening is, here's the brush pile, okay? Here's the bottom of the water, or here's the bottom of the lake. This is 18 feet of water. The brush pile is right here. This brush pile is 8 feet tall, so it tops out to, 10 feet. So it's 10 feet down there, okay? A lot of the biggest bass in the lake are gonna set up in the very top of the brush pile. Why? Okay, this is all dependent on the lake you fish, though. Typically they suspend, because then ultimately when a shad school comes over, swims over that brush pile, they're able to have the best ambush place, okay? Now, if there's a lot of crappie in this brush pile, that largemouth might be down, or that spot, or, might be down in the brush pile. And it'll all change depending on if it's sunny or cloudy. They change their positioning, of course, how they're ultimately gonna be set up and all that stuff. But the reason why I'll throw 14 is, again, I don't have to get this crankbait down to the base of the brush pile all the time. A lot of times all I want to do is get that 15-foot diving crankbait down about 12 or 13 feet deep, boom, deflect, come off, crank it over the brush pile, bam, that's when they bite it. So that is really why line size, I'll upsize my line size when I'm cranking rock or brush and or stumps. Now, as far as the reel I selected for this rod, it is the same 6:8 gear ratio Paradigm casting reel. This is my Jacob Wheeler Series reel, my 7.6 medium heavy cranking rod, and then that 12 to 14 pound subexpanded fluorocarbon. So that's really the two things there. Now, as far as upgrades, you can upgrade your hooks. I don't personally upgrade my split rings on these two crankbaits, but I do upgrade my hooks a lot of times. Now these are I think these are more like triple grips sort of stuff. I think they're triple grips on the Cliffbanger. I typically will swap those over to like the VMC hybrids, and I'll do the same thing with the DT16s or DT14s. If I want to upgrade my size of my hook, I will, and I'll bump them up there a little bit. If I'm worried about hanging the brush, I might even go down to a size number 4. A lot of times when those fish commit to that crankbait, they come out there and just drill it, and that's when I'll sort of switch it up from there. But that is sort of like, as far as upgrades, you definitely can upgrade the hooks. I've even played around with the BMC bladed hybrid treble. on the front, especially when you're talking about middle to late summer. When they get on that smaller bait, I have had success with them on a crankbait, cranking that brush pile or cranking a little bit of wood or stumps, and then that fish coming out of there and eating just that blade. Because you're not, a lot of times when they're biting this crankbait, you're not on the bottom. You're actually, that bait comes over that piece of cover and they come up and grab it. All right, if you end up getting a crankbait that runs sideways, I don't think I've ever had a Rapala DT series crankbait run sideways out of the pack. They are tank tested. I've not really had that many issues with the cliffhangers either, but typically the plastic baits are a little bit harder, so you do sometimes have to tune them. If they're running to the left a little bit, you want to make your cast, make sure that bait is running completely straight along that line. And if they're running a little bit to the left, you tweak it just a little bit to the right, so you go the opposite way. You don't, that's just something simple, easy, small little tweaks. I'm still running to the left, tweak a little bit more to the right, and you're good to go. So that's something that's going to allow that crankbait to run a little bit better. But before we go, I'm going to go out here, we're going to make a couple casts. I'm going to show you and demonstrate exactly what I'm talking about. And if we can get an image on Active Target to show you sort of and explain why you can look at on that, like that would be sort of cool, and you can sort of understand a little bit just off of, I don't know if we can get a crisp image or not, but I'm pretty sure we can I can at least show you the presentation of how I'm cranking this crankbait over how I'm cranking this crankbait right here. All right, so before we jump into the cast right here and sort of diving into cranking brush or cover with that cliffhanger, I'm going to stress this again. Do not overemphasize color. A lot of times colors can matter, but they're more the hues. That is the one thing that I see a lot of anglers do, and a lot of beginners do. They spend all their time trying to, well, they're not biting this color, and they're spending a half of their day swapping over to another color, and at the end of the day, they're just maybe not biting a crankbait that day. So you just really keep it simple. Pick a few colors that you personally like. This one right here has that purpley colored, purple, I forget the name of that color right here, but it is sort of a cool, unique color. And a lot of people do like purple. I mean, like fish like purple, so why not? So let's just jump into it right here. There's a brush pile here. You can sort of see there's a fish tractor sign. And I can actually see maybe there's a couple of them in it. So I'm going to first make that cast to see where the crankbait's at. That's all blow up right there. Well, there it is. It's down to 15. No, that's not cow. One tip on approaching an offshore score or offshore point or a brush pile, I always will go down be on the downwind side. It's tougher to get the distance. Now, the only difference that I won't do this is when I'm trying to get distance out of my crankbait. If I'm going to go to school, then I'm going to utilize that wind to my advantage. If I can't get down to that desired depth, I'll get upwind of them. But it's harder to make that cast and really know you're hitting the perfect cast when you're upwind of those places. So I'll get a line up and I'll just launch it up into the air, let that wind carry me and get another 20, 30 feet, which will ultimately get you down there a little bit faster. But that is one huge tip. No matter where you're at offshore, you get a little bit of wind. You don't want to get up on top of that group or on top of that brush pile or on top of whatever you're fishing. Typically, that is the number one deal that I always recommend when you're offshore fishing. All right, so I'm going to explain to you all how I make a cast. You know, at least on when I'm fishing around the cover, I want to ultimately, or brush, stumps, those kind of things. I really want to be able to be a little bit closer to that place because I have to really feel what's going on. So I'm going to be about 60 to 80 feet out from that piece of cover or whatever I'm really targeting. Now, so I don't need as much distance in my cast. So a lot of times I'll even make one cast, but I'll just do a lob right there. I'll fire it out there like that, lob it. I don't have to get the whole rod loaded up in there, you know, and that's the big difference. Is I'm going to get it down to that depth, and then I'm going to really sort of slowly pull this crankbait because I'm really pulling the crankbait until I hit that piece of cover. I'm not speed cranking it necessarily. As you get better at it, you can actually more speed crank it because you'll understand, hey, I hit that piece, you'll know and register when you hit that piece of cover. But right now I'm really just, okay, there's a little bit of something right there. So I'll hit it, I'll deflect off it, and then I'll give it line so that bait can float up and crank around over that breast pile. Let's see. Get my cast. So I'm gonna like keep it out. Should do a cast right here. So I'm gonna crank it down there. Then I'm gonna hit it. Yeah, there's a piece of cover. I'm gonna walk it over it. I'm telling you. Turn that on. You got it off of that wheel. So I'm walking that crankbait. A buddy of mine, Brian Wallman, taught me this a long time ago. You're walking that crankbait through that cover. So you go, you pull it a little bit, tip it right there. That's why you need that buoyant crankbait, because at the end of the day, when you hit that piece of cover, a lot of times it's so tall that if you don't have a little bit more of a buoyant crankbait, your crankbait's gonna get hung up every time. So there's one right there. I'm literally, it's really tall brush pile. I'll pull it over there. So I literally was down like at the base of it right there, and I let it float back up. Take one more cast. And typically you're gonna know pretty quick when they're on that stuff. Like you're gonna get a bite pretty quickly if that's the deal. There it is. Brush them off. Just a little bit cheap it out of the same day. There's the brush pile. Give me a video of that. Boy, so there. There's my crankbait right there. There's the brush pile coming. Cranking in it. Crankbait just went out of it. The other side. I'm going to cast it. Okay, it's going down right there. Keep going. Back and hit it. A lot of crappie there. So a lot of these brush piles, you can't even get a worm barely through, but you have to have that. The taller the pile and the deeper your crankbait runs, the tougher it is to get that crankbait through there. There it is right there, that brush. And that's why I said, like, figuring out the perfect crankbait for what you're dealing with and knowing the feel of it is very important. Alright. Want to make sure I think that's one off again. Okay. So now I'm going to show you real quick here what I do when I'm talking about throwing it out, when I'm really trying to get it down there. As far as the cast came, there I'm making my little 80 to 100 foot cast, maybe like 75 to 80 feet. I'm trying to get that bait past that piece of cover, get it down there to the desired depth. But I don't need that length. Now we're talking about a DT 16 or a DT 20. It's completely different as far as cranking. You see, like I really slowed down a lot when I was cranking that place. So now this deal, I'm using two hands a lot of times. I'm not using that one hand. I'm really loading up. I'm bringing this fly back a little bit. Yeah. Got me? So what I'm going to do is, it's almost an around the world cast. The whole key is you really have to allow that rod to load up, and then you're just boomeranging it, boom, out. That's how you're utilizing that length of that rod. Now I was a slower deal for you guys, just so you guys could see. You know, I cast a little bit slower. You could see exactly what was going on. I'll show you again here. So I go around. Whoa. Ready, one more time. Now that's probably like 130. Now the one thing, my retrieve completely changes. So now when I'm really speed reeling this, stop, speed, stop. When I don't have the cover in the way, and I'm talking about just a point, a rocky point or something like that, I'm really trying to make those fish react. They don't have anything down there necessarily. A lot of places, there we go, that those fish will really, I have to basically hit the bottom and deflect up, kick up off the bottom to get those fish to react. So you'll see I'll burn that crankbait. A lot of times I'll just reel it as fast as I can through them, and if that doesn't work, I'll stop it, start it, stop it, start it, but I'm not making those slower pulls as much. I will do it at times to switch it up in the school, but most times it's not. It's more about making those fish react. And you'll see that difference of cranking that crankbait down there. It's a completely different deal. Absolutely completely different retrieve. You're pulling that thing through there. One deal is your whole intention is to hit the piece of cover, one piece of cover or a row of stumps out there, and the other you're trying to make those fish react off of the hard bottom they're sitting on, and that crankbait getting down there and deflecting off of that stuff. A little bit different cast, a little bit different methods to crankbait fishing. That's what it's all about. All right. I'm gonna run into one more place. Ooh, there he is. So that fish right there, literally that crankbait right there, little deep diving crankbait fishing. Reacted to that, that's what it's all about. Not the biggest one, skinny, no spawn, but selecting your crankbaits is everything, and making sure you know your crankbaits is everything. So whether you're deep diving cranking with a bigger plug like that guy right there, or you're targeting brush piles and isolated pieces of cover like this guy right here, you can pay dividends by knowing everything there is to know about crankbait fishing. Hopefully these tips helped you guys out. I wanted to give you guys a good rundown of what I've known and what I've learned over the years. I'm gonna let this guy go right here. See you later, buddy. And we're gonna say goodbye. Thanks for watching. See y'all.